The diamond was priceless, the deception flawless, but in Julian Graves's office, there was no such thing as an unsolvable mystery, and for Ernestine Richards, the game she thought she had played so cleverly was already lost, before she had even walked through his door. The buzzer on Mr. Julian Graves' desk let out a low, insistent hum. "Yes," he said without looking up. "A young woman to see you, sir," his assistant announced. "No appointment," he exhaled sharply. "Send her in, Clara." A moment later the door creaked open. The woman who entered was young, mid-twenties perhaps. Dark wavy hair framed a face that might have been beautiful, were it not for the deep shadows beneath her eyes. She wore a tailored coat, elegant but understated, her fingers clenching a small black purse. "Good morning," Julian said, motioning to the chair across from him. The woman hesitated before sitting, her posture rigid. "You're Mr. Julian Graves, the very one, the one who fixes things, makes problems disappear." He tilted his head. "That depends on the problem," she inhaled sharply, as though gathering courage. I think I've done something terrible." "No, I know I have." Julian said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was often the best encouragement. She clenched her hands, eyes darting to the heavy velvet curtains, as though someone might be listening. Then, in a breathless rush, she said, "I think I stole something, but I don't remember doing it." Julian leaned forward slightly. "You think?" Her lips trembled. "Yes, because when I woke up this morning, there it was, in my hand, and I have no idea how it got there." Slowly she reached into her purse, and withdrew a velvet pouch. She tipped it over, and something tumbled onto the desk, flashing, dazzling, catching the dim light with an almost hypnotic glow, a diamond ring, large, brilliant, and unmistakably valuable. Julian picked it up, turning it between his fingers. "This isn't just a ring," he murmured. "This is a declaration, a threat, or a very expensive mistake." The woman let out a shuddering breath. "I don't know whose it is. I don't even remember last night. But I know one thing, if someone finds out I have this, I might not live long enough to return it." Julian studied her, his mind already working. A blackout, a stolen ring, and fear, deep, gut-wrenching fear. This wasn't just theft, this was a trap, and she had walked straight into it. "You see, I have a terrible habit of spending too much money. I suppose you could say I'm frightfully extravagant." The woman across from Julian Graves exhaled sharply, wringing her hands together. "And my husband, William, he absolutely detests it. He's always been so disciplined, rigid, even. He believes that financial irresponsibility is practically a moral failing, so I never tell him about the little debts, the splurges, the times when She broke off, shaking her head. Julian simply watched, his expression unreadable. He had dealt with enough troubled souls to know that silence was sometimes the best way to draw out the truth. She swallowed, took a shaky breath, and continued. "Last week I went to Monte Carlo with some friends. I thought just for a bit of fun, you know, and perhaps, just perhaps, I could turn my luck around at the tables, maybe win enough to make up for what I overspent. And at first I did. I was winning. The rush of it, the way the numbers worked in my favor, it was intoxicating." She let out a dry, bitter laugh. "But then I lost. And then I lost more. And then, well, I couldn't stop. I kept thinking, just one more bet, just one more chance. But chance doesn't care about you, does it, Mr. Graves?" Julian gave a small shake of the head, his expression still carefully neutral. "And by the time I left Monte Carlo, I was ruined, not just financially, but completely. I couldn't tell William. He'd never forgive me. He might," she hesitated, "he might leave me." The weight of those words settled in the air between them. "So," she continued after a pause, "we returned to England, and that's when we visited the Winthrops. Their estate is magnificent, of course. Old money. Their wealth practically drips from the chandeliers. I've known Olivia Winthrop since school. She's sweet, really, always so generous." Julian tapped a finger against the desk, sensing they were arriving at the heart of it. "On our last morning there, Olivia asked me to do her a favor, just a small one. She had a ring, a magnificent thing, with the most dazzling emerald I've ever seen. She had worn it the night before, but one of the prongs had come loose, and she didn't want to risk losing the stone, so she asked if I could take it to her jeweler's in London. I agreed, of course. It seemed simple enough. She stopped. Her fingers tightened into fists, knuckles going white. "Go on," Julian prompted. Her voice dropped to a whisper, but I didn't go straight to the jeweler's. He leaned forward slightly. "Where did you go?" "There's another shop on Bond Street, Luxor's. They're known for their discretion. They specialize in creating perfect replicas of fine jewelry. No questions asked." I don't even know what came over me, but suddenly I was walking in, telling them I wanted an exact copy of the ring. I made up some nonsense about traveling abroad, about not wanting to carry the real thing with me. She let out a shaky laugh. They believed me. They took the ring, examined it, and assured me they could craft an indistinguishable duplicate. Julian said nothing, waiting. I told myself I was just being practical, that I'd return the real one, and sell the fake one to pay my debts. But then, she shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Then last night happened." Julian tilted his head. "What happened last night?" Her gaze darted to the window, as if expecting someone to be listening. "I don't remember." He raised an eyebrow. "I mean it. I don't remember. One moment, I was at a dinner party, and the next, I woke up in my own bed, with the real ring still in my possession. I checked my purse, my coat, everything, but the duplicate, it was gone." Julian sat back, steepling his fingers. "So now there's only one conclusion, isn't there?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Someone knows what I did, and they took the fake, which means they want something from me." A slow, knowing smile spread across Julian's face. "Or worse," he murmured, "they want to see what you'll do next." She gasped, her breath catching in her throat, because in that moment she realized, she wasn't just caught in a web of deceit, she was being played. "You must understand," she whispered, her fingers trembling as they clutched the delicate ring, the gem catching the dim light of the room. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't planning to do something so unforgivable." Julian Graves studied the woman before him, noting the way her pale complexion contrasted with the dark silk of her dress. Her face was drawn, weary from sleepless nights, her lips pressed into a thin line of regret. He had seen this expression before, this exact look, on people who had gone too far, and realized there was no way to turn back. "I sent the imitation," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "A perfect copy, indistinguishable from the original. I even had a proper jeweler's box, an elegant wrapping. It was all done professionally. No one would have questioned it. And then, I pawned the real one." A heavy silence filled the space between them. Julian didn't speak, he simply observed. "It was so easy," she went on, almost to herself now, eyes distant as if reliving the moment. "Too easy. I took the money, paid off every debt, every last humiliating bill that had been clawing at my throat. For the first time in months, I could breathe. I could sleep without feeling that crushing weight in my chest." Her breathing hitched. "And yet, I felt sick," she whispered, "like I had become someone else, something else, a fraud, a thief." Julian finally spoke, his voice calm but deliberate, and then, her gaze snapped back to him, wild with emotion, and then an unexpected miracle happened. She said bitterly,
"He's an old relative of mine.
An estranged cousin, someone I barely knew, died, left me a considerable sum of money, enough to clear my name, to fix everything. The very first thing I did was redeem the ring. I had it back in my possession, the real one. I could undo my mistake. It should have been simple." Julian leaned forward slightly, "But it wasn't, was it?" She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "No, because fate decided to mock me one last time." She swallowed. "You see, between the time I sent the fake and now, things changed. The friendship between my husband and the Winthrops soured. There were business dealings involved, bad investments, betrayal, accusations of manipulation. My husband lost a fortune, all because of them. He hates them now, loathes them. He's cut ties completely. If he even suspected I had anything of theirs, he would demand to know why." She clenched her jaw.
"And so,
"You see my problem, Mr. Graves. I have the real ring, but I have no way of returning it without exposing what I did." Julian was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled together in thought. You could send it anonymously, he suggested. She let out a humorless chuckle. You think I haven't thought of that? The moment Olivia examines it closely, she'll realize it's not the one she's been wearing. She'll know it's a replacement. And who will she suspect first? Me. She trusted me with it. She'll put the pieces together, and when she does, she exhaled shakily. My husband will find out, and he will never forgive me. Julian watched her closely.
Then why are you here?
Mrs. Whitmore. Her lips parted slightly, then closed again. I suppose I was hoping you'd tell me what to do.
She admitted, finally.
A small knowing smile touched Julian's lips. Oh, Mrs. Whitmore, he murmured. That, I can certainly do. She looked at him with something. In that moment she realized, she hadn't just walked into a stranger's office, she had walked into the hands of a man who thrived on secrets, and now her fate was in his hands. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice tight with desperation. This isn't just about guilt anymore, it's about time. I'm running out of time. Evelyn Whitmore's hands trembled as she clutched the ring, the glistening diamond reflecting the dim light in the office. Her breath was shallow, erratic, her mind racing as she searched Julian Graves' face for some hint of a solution, some impossible escape from the nightmare she had spun around herself. Julian, ever composed, merely observed her, fingers steepled as he leaned back in his chair. Go on, he said calmly. She let out a sharp, shaky breath. Naomi is having the ring reset. His expression didn't change, but she could sense the flicker of intrigue behind those sharp, calculating eyes. How do you know this? He asked. I overheard it, she admitted. By accident. A woman at a luncheon, one of those idle, careless conversations people have when they assume no one is really listening. She mentioned Naomi's plans, said it was the newest trend, that Naomi wanted her diamond set differently, something more fashion-forward. She swallowed hard. Do you understand what that means? Julian nodded slightly. If she resets the ring, she may examine it more closely. If she does, she'll know. Evelyn finished in a whisper. She'll realize the stone she's been wearing isn't the one she originally had. She'll have it tested, and the second she finds out it's a fake, she'll know you betrayed her. Julian interjected smoothly. Evelyn shut her eyes for a moment, and then everything unravels. Naomi doesn't forgive betrayals, especially not when it comes to money or jewelry. If she exposes me, if she tells anyone what I've done, Gerald will find out, and if he does, I lose everything. Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment she looked so utterly lost that even Julian, who had spent years untangling the desperate schemes of the wealthy and the reckless, felt the weight of her impending doom. And so, he said at last, the only solution is to replace the fake with the original before Naomi ever suspects. Evelyn nodded frantically. But how? How do I do it? Naomi would never lend me the ring again. Not now. I can't just waltz into her home and slip it back into her jewelry box, and there's no way I can steal it back from her.
I wouldn't even know where to begin.
Julian raised a hand, silencing her spiraling thoughts. This is not an impossible problem, Mrs. Whitmore, he said. It is, however, a delicate one. One misstep, and you risk everything, not just your reputation, but your entire life as you know it. She let out a breath. Then tell me what to do. Julian studied her for a long moment. Then finally, a slow knowing smile crossed his lips. There is a way, he murmured, but you must trust me completely, and you must be willing to do exactly as I say. Evelyn met his gaze, her heart hammering in her chest. At that moment she knew. Whatever came next, whatever price she had to pay, she had no choice but to place her fate in the hands of a man who thrived on secrets, and he was about to turn her greatest mistake into his most dangerous game yet. Evelyn's breath came fast, her fingers clenched around the edge of the desk. So you understand, Mr. Graves, there's no time left. Wednesday night is my last chance. Julian Graves, ever composed, merely leaned back in his chair, watching her with the patience of a man who had solved far too many impossible problems. Then we must ensure you succeed. She swallowed.
A party.
Naomi's hosting a grand affair. She was looking for exhibition dancers, though I don't know if she's settled on anyone yet. Julian's lips curled into something resembling amusement. Then that is how we get inside. She blinked.
We.
You don't think I'd leave this in your hands, do you? His voice was velvet, but his meaning was steel. If I leave you to it, you'll panic at the last moment, and we'll have a disaster on our hands. No, Mrs. Whitmore, I handle things personally. The heartbeat pounded in her ears.
But how?
You can't just, I have people, he interrupted smoothly, two, in particular, who will be quite useful, Claude and Celine. You'll like them. He reached for the intercom on his desk, and pressed the button, send them in.
Moments later, the door swung open.
Claude Luttrell was everything a woman might dream of. Tall, devastatingly handsome, and exuding an effortless charm that made people trust him far too easily. His sharp navy blue suit was impeccable, his posture exuding confidence. Beside him, Celine Devara was a vision of allure, raven hair cascading over her shoulders, dark eyes framed with smoky liner, lips painted a perfect shade of danger, a woman born to be watched, and she knew it. Ah, there you are, Julian said, surveying them with approval. My dear Claude, my lovely Celine, I have an assignment for you. Claude smirked. Aren't we lucky? Celine slid into a chair, crossing one leg over the other, her eyes flicking to Evelyn. Is she the job? Julian chuckled. Not quite. The job is far more interesting. You two will be appearing as world-renowned exhibition dancers at a certain high society event. Claude raised a brow. We don't dance. You'll learn, Julian said smoothly. Or at least you'll look the part. The performance is a distraction. The real act happens elsewhere. Evelyn exhaled, still struggling to believe any of this was happening. The ring, she murmured. The real ring needs to be put back before Naomi ever suspects. Celine's fingers tapped idly against the armrest. And where's the fake now? In her possession, Julian answered. But she intends to have it reset. Soon. Which means we have one opportunity to make the swap before she notices anything amiss. Claude sighed theatrically. And let me guess, this isn't going to be as simple as slipping it onto a dresser and waltzing out. Julian's gaze sharpened. No, it requires precision. Evelyn knows where the main power switch is, inside a small cupboard in the hall. If the lights were to accidentally go out at the right moment. Celine's lips parted in understanding. Ah, Julian continued. Claude, you'll be performing. You'll command attention. Keep their eyes on you. Celine, well, you do what you do best, and in the chaos the swap will be made. Evelyn watched them both, her stomach tight with nerves, and if something goes wrong, Celine smiled wickedly. Nothing goes wrong when Julian Graves is running the show. But Evelyn knew better. She had played a dangerous game once before, and she had lost. Now she was betting everything on the man who claimed to have never lost a game. For all their sakes, she could only hope he was right. Lady Astoria Blackwood stood at the top of the grand staircase, a glass of champagne in hand, surveying the ballroom with quiet satisfaction. The chandeliers cast a golden glow over a sea of elegantly dressed guests, their laughter and chatter blending with the waltzing notes of the orchestra. Nothing had gone wrong. Not yet. Her husband, Lord Blackwood, leaned in. Everything is perfect, my dear. She nodded, though a slight frown marred her otherwise composed expression. Almost it's a shame the original dancers had to cancel, but the replacements, they come highly recommended. Performed in Paris, I hear. Across the room the new performers had arrived. The man was tall, effortlessly graceful, with the dark, smoldering eyes of a predator. His partner, a woman with the kind of beauty that made men reckless, adjusted the red silk of her dress, her gaze scanning the room. The night progressed splendidly. When the moment arrived, the dancers took the floor and all eyes turned to them. The performance was electrifying, a blend of passion and danger, their movements telling a story both sensual and ominous. The final act, an intimate tango, left the audience breathless. As the last note lingered in the air, the man introducing himself as Raphael stepped toward Lady Blackwood. May I have this dance? She hesitated only a fraction of a second before placing her hand in his. His grip was warm, firm, and when he pulled her onto the dance floor, it was as though she had stepped into another world. He moved like he knew her body better than she did. Their steps were slow, deliberate, charged with an energy that made her pulse quicken. You are not from England, he murmured against her ear. She shivered. What makes you say that? Your spirit, untamed. His lips curved in a half-smile, like the wind over the Pyrenees. She felt light-headed. The world beyond their small circle faded, the guests, the music, even her husband watching from across the room. Then darkness. Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Someone shrieked, a voice cursed. The orchestra faltered, then fell silent. In the blackness she felt Raphael's grip on her tighten, a rush of heat against her wrist, the brush of his lips, intimate, lingering. When the lights returned she found herself staring into his eyes. He smiled, still holding her hand. "Your ring," he said, voice low. It nearly slipped off. She looked down. He was sliding it back onto her finger. Had it fallen? Or had he? Her heart pounded. She should pull away. She should say something. Instead she let him press it back into place, his fingers lingering just a little too long. Across the room, Lord Blackwood was speaking to a butler. Some fool must have tripped the main switch. A prank, no doubt. But Lady Blackwood was no longer listening. The minutes of darkness had been unforgettable. The next morning, Evelyn Ashworth arrived at Julian Graves' office, breathless with anticipation. "Well?" she asked. Julian, as calm as ever, steepled his fingers. "Everything," he said, "went exactly as planned." "You look pale," Julian Graves said, his piercing gaze fixed on Evelyn as she took the chair across from him. His voice wasn't accusing, but it held something more dangerous, curiosity. She shook her head, forcing a weak smile. "I couldn't sleep last night. I was wondering." Without another word, he reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a neatly folded sheet of paper, and slid it toward her. "Here's the breakdown of expenses, train fares, costumes, and a small compensation to Michael and Juanita for their unfortunate accident. £65 and 17 shillings in total." Evelyn barely glanced at it. Yes, but about last night, was it all right? Did it happen?" Julian leaned back, his expression unreadable. "My dear Miss Ashworth, I assumed you understood. Naturally it is all right." A breath of relief escaped her lips. "I was afraid that." He raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence, shaking his head with a soft chuckle. "Failure is not a word I tolerate. If I take a case it is because I know it will succeed. That is why people come to me." She exhaled, pressing her palms together. "So she really has it. She suspects nothing." "Nothing whatsoever." The operation was executed with absolute precision. The switch, the timing, the exchange, it was seamless. Lady Blackwood has her ring, or at least she believes she does. Evelyn let out a laugh, light, breathless, almost delirious. "You don't know the weight you've lifted off my shoulders." Julian, amused by her reaction, tapped his fingers against the desk. "Now then, about the expenses." Without hesitation, she opened her handbag, counted the notes, and placed them before him. He accepted them with a nod, scribbled a receipt, and handed it back. "But your fee," she murmured. "This is only for expenses. In this case, Miss Ashworth, there is no fee." She blinked. "No, I couldn't. I insist." His voice was final. "Taking a penny from you would be against my principles." There was something unsettling in the way he said it, something that made Evelyn's stomach twist. And then, with the air of a magician unveiling his greatest trick, he reached into his pocket and placed a small velvet box in front of her. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, staring back at her in the dim morning light, was an identical diamond ring. A sharp gasp left her lips. "You," she swallowed hard, staring at the piece of jewelry that had caused her so many sleepless nights. "You brute," she said, half laughing, half terrified. "How I hate you." Julian only smiled, eyes twinkling with mischief. "You wouldn't throw it out the window, would you? That might raise some questions." Evelyn gritted her teeth, shutting the box with a snap. "You're absolutely sure it's not the real one?" He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Miss Ashworth, the ring you showed me days ago, the real one, is still safely on Lady Blackwood's delicate little finger." And then, just like that, he leaned back, utterly composed, while Evelyn sat there, pulse racing, unable to shake the feeling that she had just been part of something much bigger than she had ever imagined. "Then, that's all right." Evelyn rose, a bright, almost giddy laugh escaping her lips, though it sounded a little too forced, a little too high. Julian Graves watched her with the patience of a man who already knew the ending to a story before it was told. Curious, you're asking me that, he mused, tapping his fingers against the desk. Of course, Claude, poor fellow, he hasn't many brains. It wouldn't be entirely out of character for him to get muddled. That's why I took an extra precaution. Evelyn's hand, halfway to closing her handbag, hesitated. Julian continued, his voice light, conversational. Just to be sure, I had an expert take a look at this little thing first thing this morning. Evelyn sat back down, this time, rather suddenly. Oh, her voice betrayed her, too clipped, too tight. Julian's smile widened, and he gave an approving nod, as though she were a child who had just asked the right question in a lesson. Yes, and you'll be pleased to know that he was quite impressed. He leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly. He called it an extraordinarily good imitation, said it was first-class work, flawless even. Evelyn's fingers curled into the fabric of her coat. So Julian continued, beaming, that sets your mind at ease, doesn't it? She opened her mouth, then closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. She stared at him, and Julian, for his part, simply sat back in his chair, looking entirely at peace, like a cat stretching lazily after stealing a saucer of cream. The cat who pulled the chestnuts out of the fire, he murmured to himself, almost dreamily. Not a single ruffle, not a single ruffle, I'd ever allow any of my staff to endure. Evelyn swallowed, hard. Her voice, when she finally found it, was barely above a whisper. Excuse me. Julian raised an eyebrow. Did you say something? I know, nothing. Good. His tone was far too pleasant. Because now, I'd like to tell you a little story. Evelyn's pulse quickened. It concerns a young woman, Julian went on, as though he hadn't noticed the way her fingers clutched her handbag a little too tightly. A fair-haired young woman, I believe she's unmarried, and he tilted his head slightly. I believe her name is not Evelyn Ashworth. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Julian's smile never wavered. Her Christian name is not Evelyn either, for that matter. No, on the contrary. Her real name is Ernestine Richards, and until very recently, she was employed as the personal secretary to Lady Blackwood. The silence in the room stretched long and thin, humming with unspoken words. Julian leaned back, steepling his fingers. Now, isn't that interesting? Do you see now, Miss Richards? Julian Graves leaned back, his fingers interlaced, a small satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Evelyn, no. Ernestine felt her pulse hammering in her throat. I don't know what you mean, she stammered, though she knew the words were unconvincing, even as they left her lips. Julian chuckled softly. Oh, but I think you do. He tapped the small velvet box on the desk between them. The diamond ring nestled inside, glinting under the soft light. A fascinating tale, isn't it? Quite like your own, I'd wager. She stayed silent. Let me spell it out then. He continued. Lady Blackwood's diamond ring, loose on her delicate little hand, a small inconvenience, easily fixed. So who better to take it to town for repairs than her ever-trusted secretary, the reliable Miss Ernestine Richards? His tone was light, almost admiring, but his eyes were sharp, watching every flicker of emotion on her face. She swallowed, but said nothing. Julian continued, his voice smooth, hypnotic. But something occurred to Miss Richards on her way to town, an opportunity, the kind that doesn't come often, a careful switch, a perfect copy, and just like that, the real diamond vanished, replaced with a flawless imitation. A pause, a beat. But you, Miss Richards, are no ordinary thief. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dipping into something more conspiratorial. No, you planned ahead. You knew inevitably Lady Blackwood would notice, and when she did, she would recall, who? The secretary, the woman who last had the ring in her possession, and suspicion would fall upon you like a guillotine. Ernestine's hands curled into fists. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to keep her face blank. But you were clever. Julian continued, as if he were praising a particularly gifted pupil. You needed a second act, a diversion, a spectacle, and so you devised the perfect illusion. He flicked his gaze to her dark brown hair. First a disguise, a simple transformation, perhaps a slight change in hair color, a different style, subtle, yet enough to become someone else in the right setting. His voice dropped lower. Then performance, a new identity, not Ernestine Richards, but someone entirely different, a radiant young woman, a captivating dancer, the kind of woman who could make a powerful man forget everything else while she spun in his arms beneath the glittering ballroom lights. Ernestine could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, and so Julian went on. The deception reached its climax, a dazzling night, a beautiful dancer, a brief power outage, a well-timed flicker of darkness, where in the span of seconds, a ring changed hands. His fingers ghosted over the velvet box once more. But of course, Miss Richards, you made a mistake. A thick silence filled the room. Her lips parted. A mistake. Julian smiled. You assumed quite rightly that the gentleman tasked with retrieving the ring was no expert in diamonds, and yet you forgot that I am not a fool. You see, I arranged for someone else to be on that train, a dear friend of mine, a diamond merchant, and the moment he laid eyes on that ring, he snapped his fingers. He knew. A slow, dawning horror crept across Ernestine's face. You see the problem, don't you, my dear? Julian's voice was almost tender now, like a parent gently scolding a wayward child. When Lady Blackwood realizes the truth, whom will she remember? His smile sharpened. Not the secretary who once handled her ring, but the mesmerizing young dancer, the one who vanished into the night, taking more than just stolen glances with her. The room seemed to shrink around her. Ernestine stood, forcing composure into every movement. I think this conversation is over, Mr. Graves. He tilted his head, still smiling. I quite agree, but you must admit, his fingers brushed the box once more. It was a rather lovely little game, wasn't it? Ernestine didn't reply. She turned, walked to the door, and stepped into the corridor, willing herself not to let her knees buckle. Only when she was far away from that office did she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and only then did she notice. Her ring finger was bare, her heart stopped. She spun on her heel, staring back at the door she had just exited. Inside, Julian Graves examined the ring between his fingers, his smile widening ever so slightly. Lovely, he murmured, and then, as if nothing had happened, he slipped it into his pocket. Julian Graves steepled his fingers and smiled, though this time there was no warmth in it. Now you understand, don't you? His voice was soft, but each word carried the weight of finality. Evelyn, no. Ernestine felt her stomach twist. He continued, his tone almost regretful. If Lady Blackwood investigates, what will she find? That the dancers who were meant to be there that night mysteriously disappeared, conveniently replaced by someone else, someone who doesn't exist. A Mrs. St. John who, I assure you, Lady Blackwood has never met. Julian leaned forward ever so slightly, his gaze locking onto hers, and once the threads begin to unravel, they will lead back here, to me. Silence. Now tell me, he murmured, his voice silk and steel, do you really think I would allow that? Ernestine felt the room closing in. A chill crept up her spine. Julian exhaled as if he were mildly disappointed. You see, my dear, this is why my friend Claude slipped the real ring back onto Lady Blackwood's finger, before she ever had a chance to suspect otherwise. A neat correction, wouldn't you say? Her nails dug into her palms. Julian's smile turned razor-sharp. And that is also why I cannot in good conscience take a fee. You came seeking happiness, Miss Richards, but it appears I have failed in that endeavor. Ernestine was trembling with rage now. You oily old brute, she spat, her voice thick with humiliation. You led me on, made me pay expenses. All the while, her breath caught. She couldn't finish. The humiliation was too sharp, too raw. Julian simply observed her, utterly unshaken. Let me leave you with one final thought, he said calmly. I have spent years compiling statistics on human nature, and based on those findings, I can tell you this, in 87% of cases, dishonesty does not pay. He paused, watching her carefully. 87%, he repeated, his voice like the closing of a vault door. Do think on that. Ernestine could take no more. With a sudden furious motion, she ripped the imitation ring from her finger and hurled it across the room. Julian caught it effortlessly. He held it out to her. Your ring, he said, ever so polite. She snatched it back with shaking hands, then in a blind surge of defiance, turned and flung it out of the open window. Outside, a street vendor selling stuffed toys paused mid-transaction as the glint of metal arced through the air, landing somewhere in the street. Ernestin didn't wait to see where it fell. She spun on her heel, stormed toward the door, and wrenched it open. The last thing she heard before the door slammed shut behind her was Julian Graves's voice, faint with amusement. "As I thought," he mused, peering out the window. "Considerable confusion has been created," and with that, he sat back in his chair, entirely unruffled, as the world outside moved on, utterly unaware of the battle that had just been won. Thank you very much for listening to this story narrated by Dr. Rami. Don't forget to subscribe to the Curious Case channel, and be sure to leave a comment.